November 1st, 1715. A profound silence fell upon the gilded halls of Versailles, a stillness pregnant with the weight of an era's end and the terrifying uncertainty of a new dawn. Across the hallowed, often blood-stained floors of the palace, a small boy, barely 5 years of age, was navigating a world utterly devoid of his parents, and now his great-grandfather, the Sun King, Louis XIV, whose formidable shadow loomed larger than life, even in death. This child, Louis XV, was instantly thrust onto the most powerful throne in Europe, a symbolic head burdened by the vast expectations of a nation he was too young to comprehend, let alone govern. His life, from this chillingly early moment, had never truly been his own. It was a destiny carved out by lineage, a public performance meticulously choreographed by ambitious courtiers and desperate statesmen. The air itself seemed to hum with a precarious tension, a fragile hope that this fragile, seemingly innocent figure would somehow embody the strength and wisdom of his predecessors, yet he was but a pawn in a monumental game of power. To understand why such a young life was subjected to such an immense, almost suffocating pressure, one must look beyond the immediate scene to the very fabric of French monarchical succession, a system that elevated bloodline above readiness, often condemning its most vulnerable to roles for which no human could ever be truly prepared. This was not a coronation of joy or even of a youthful promise, but rather the quiet inauguration of a lifelong sacrifice, a perversion of childhood that would tragically echo in the king's own later predilections, setting a somber precedent for the catastrophic erosion of moral authority. The seeds of detachment, of a profound isolation that would manifest in unimaginable ways, were sown in these very initial moments, a silent torment beginning long before the world could ever truly witness the horrifying consequences. The weight of the crown was crushing, an invisible burden that sculpted a boy into a king, but never truly allowed him the solace of unburdened youth. To grasp the weight of this moment, and the ensuing psychological landscape that shaped Louis XV, one must delve into the suffocating atmosphere of his regency. Deprived of his parents by disease in his infancy, and then his great-grandfather's colossal presence, the boy king was raised under the meticulous, yet ultimately isolating tutelage of Cardinal Fleury, a figure of immense intellect, but perhaps limited warmth. This carefully controlled environment, while ensuring his education in statecraft and theology, often lacked the genuine affection and grounding that might have fostered a more empathetic or self-aware ruler. Instead, he was perpetually observed, a living symbol rather than a developing individual, perpetually reminded of his divine right and the inherent superiority of his station. The affairs of state were conducted around him, often without his full comprehension, a world of intricate political maneuvers and moral compromises that would subtly, yet irrevocably, shape his perception of power and accountability. His childhood, rather than being a period of natural discovery and burgeoning selfhood, was a relentless procession of lessons, ceremonies, and the stifling protocols of court, each reinforcing an almost impenetrable barrier between the monarch and the everyday human experience. This was not an anomaly. It was a reflection of a system that demanded unyielding reverence for its figurehead, even at the cost of his humanity. The young king, encased in this golden cage, would come to view the world, and indeed its inhabitants, through a lens distorted by absolute power and an intrinsic sense of entitlement, a perspective that tragically paved the way for his later, more egregious abuses. The very mechanisms designed to protect the heir, to ensure the continuity of the realm, inadvertently became the subtle instruments of his profound detachment, crafting a monarch who, despite outward displays of piety, would ultimately succumb to the most base of human temptations, leaving a legacy far removed from the beloved moniker he once briefly held. The lack of genuine connection, of an authentic emotional anchor, would prove to be a gaping void that his power would desperately, and ultimately destructively, attempt to fill. Initially, the reign of Louis XV was marked by a fragile and deceptive popularity, an almost ephemeral honeymoon period where he was affectionately dubbed Louis the Beloved by a hopeful populace. This moniker, however, was less a reflection of his inherent virtue and more a projection of the nation's longing for stability after the long, often brutal reign of his predecessor. The young king, handsome and seemingly devout, fulfilled the aesthetic expectations of his role, presenting a dignified, if somewhat aloof, public persona. Yet beneath this veneer of royal grace, a profound disillusionment was quietly taking root. The early years saw him delegate much of the governance, retreating increasingly into his private world, a stark contrast to the omnipresent, centralized authority of Louis XIV. This growing distance between the monarch and his people was not merely geographical. It was an emotional and ideological chasm that widened with each passing year, fueled by his increasing disinterest in the arduous tasks of statecraft and his burgeoning pursuit of personal gratification. His early, politically advantageous marriage to Marie Leschinska, while producing many legitimate heirs, did little to anchor his restless spirit or quell his growing appetite for varied companionship, particularly as the queen aged and withdrew from the suffocating demands of courtly life. The seeds of his moral decline, initially barely perceptible whispers within the palace walls, began to germinate in this fertile ground of privilege and unchecked desire. The public image, carefully cultivated and broadcast through royal portraiture and state ceremony, began to crack under the strain of a burgeoning private reality, a world where the king's personal indulgences would steadily erode the very foundations of his divinely ordained authority. The initial promise of a benevolent reign slowly but irrevocably began to transmute into a pervasive sense of disappointment, foreshadowing a period of profound scandal and moral decay that would come to define his legacy. As the years advanced and the burdens of kingship seemed to weigh ever more heavily upon a monarch fundamentally uninterested in the intricate dance of governance, Louis XV sought refuge and fulfillment within the increasingly opaque walls of his private life. This retreat culminated in the creation of the infamous Petits Appartements within Versailles, a series of secret chambers and hidden passages designed to facilitate clandestine rendezvous and shield the king's illicit activities from the prying eyes of the court and the moral judgment of his queen. This architectural deception was a physical manifestation of a deeper moral inversion. The king, who by divine right was meant to embody virtue, justice, and the very soul of the nation, was instead becoming the architect of his own moral degradation, an emperor of hidden vices. Within these cloistered spaces, protected by layers of courtiers whose complicity was bought or coerced, Louis XV cultivated a secret society dedicated to his personal pleasure. The rigid etiquette and public performance demanded by the grandeur of Versailles were shed, replaced by a climate of unchecked indulgence and an alarming sense of entitlement. This was not merely a monarch seeking illicit companionship. It was a powerful man systematically constructing an entire apparatus to satisfy his increasingly depraved desires, an institutionalization of vice that would eventually ensnare and destroy the lives of countless individuals. The sanctity of the monarchy, once thought inviolable, was being desecrated not by external enemies or political rivals, but by the very figurehead meant to uphold its sacred tenets. The whispers of these hidden rooms and their illicit activities began to circulate, initially as titillating gossip among the aristocracy, but eventually permeating the wider populace, slowly poisoning the wellspring of public respect. The transformation of a once beloved king into a figure of quiet scandal and moral decrepitude marked a pivotal turning point, where the private failures of the monarch would inevitably cascade into the public sphere, shattering the illusion of unimpeachable royal authority and paving the way for far greater societal disillusionment. Perhaps the most haunting manifestation of this profound moral decay was the notorious Parc aux Cerfs, a secluded property acquired and maintained by the king, ostensibly as a private hunting lodge, but serving a far more sinister purpose. This was not merely a discreet love nest, it was a meticulously organized system for the procurement and housing of young women, often girls barely past childhood, who were presented to the king for his sexual gratification. The operation was managed by trusted agents, and the young women were frequently promised pensions, advantageous marriages, or other forms of security in exchange for their service, though their ultimate fates often remained tragically obscure, their lives irrevocably scarred, or simply consumed and discarded by the royal appetite. The systematic nature of this exploitation, the cold, calculating efficiency with which these vulnerable lives were brought into the king's orbit, stands as a chilling testament to the absolute power wielded without moral compass. Each girl who passed through its gates represented a devastating sacrifice, a childhood innocence destroyed by the very institution meant to protect its subjects, a fragile spirit crushed under the immense weight of royal prerogative. Her life, upon entering this gilded cage, had never truly been her own. These were not willing participants in a conventional affair. They were subjects of an invisible yet crushing state violence, their personhood reduced to mere objects of fleeting royal pleasure. The whispers surrounding the Parc aux Cerfs, though often veiled and subject to courtly discretion, contributed significantly to the growing public outrage and the erosion of the monarchy's moral legitimacy. It was a stark, undeniable symbol of the king's profound detachment from the very people he ruled, a stark perversion of his sacred duty. The knowledge that such depraved acts were committed by the anointed head of state, often against the defenseless and the young, fueled a deep-seated resentment that would fester for decades, ultimately contributing to the volatile socio-political climate that would violently erupt in the coming revolution. The insidious rot of Louis XV's private life inexorably began to erode the very foundations of royal authority, chipping away at the divine right of kings with each passing scandal. The whispers of the Parc aux Cerfs and the king's increasingly blatant infidelities, particularly with figures like Madame de Pompadour and later Madame du Barry, transformed public perception from reverence to cynical disdain and eventually outright contempt. The monarchy, once seen as an unassailable bastion of order and tradition, was increasingly viewed as a corrupt and decadent institution, consumed by self-indulgence and oblivious to the suffering of its people. This wasn't merely a matter of personal morality. It was a profound failure of leadership, as the king's disinterest in governance deepened, leading to political stagnation, ruinous wars, and a spiraling national debt. Critical decisions were often delayed or avoided, and the machinery of state lumbered on without a firm hand at the helm, leaving a vacuum that factions and self-serving courtiers eagerly filled. The once beloved monarch was now openly mocked in satirical pamphlets and clandestine songs, which circulated with increasing boldness, portraying him not as a benevolent father figure, but as a dissipated pleasure seeker, a man who prioritized his mistresses and hunting over the welfare of France. This widespread disillusionment was a direct consequence of the perceived moral bankruptcy at the top, a silent yet potent indictment of a system that allowed such unchecked power to fester without accountability. The sense that the king had betrayed his sacred trust, that the very system meant to protect them had become their executioner through neglect and abuse, permeated all levels of society. The implicit social contract between ruler and ruled was breaking down, replaced by a simmering resentment that spoke not of loyalty, but of a profound and growing sense of injustice, subtly but powerfully sowing the seeds of rebellion in the collective consciousness of a nation on the precipice. The unseen costs of Louis XV's prolonged reign of moral and political lassitude extended far beyond mere public opinion. They permeated the very fabric of French society, creating a deep and irreparable fissure between the crown and its subjects. The widespread perception of a king consumed by his own pleasures, utterly detached from the burgeoning economic crises and social inequalities gripping the nation, fueled a profound sense of injustice. While the lavish expenditures on royal mistresses and secret apartments were mere drops in the ocean of France's burgeoning national debt, they served as potent symbols of the monarchy's indifference, igniting popular fury with their stark contrast to the widespread poverty and famine plaguing the common people. This moral decay, emanating from the highest echelons of power, seemed to seep downwards, corrupting the court and administrative apparatus, fostering an environment of self-interest and corruption, where true reform was stifled at every turn. The once unshakable belief in divine right began to crumble under the weight of such blatant irresponsibility and abuse, as philosophers and revolutionaries openly questioned the legitimacy of a ruler who seemed to care so little for his people. The political paralysis that characterized much of Louis XV's later years, a direct consequence of his lack of engagement and his reliance on favored, yet often inept advisors, meant that critical reforms were delayed or abandoned, exacerbating the very problems that were pushing France towards an inevitable breaking point. The murmurs of discontent, once confined to intellectual salons, began to swell into a chorus of popular anger, finding expression in pamphlets and clandestine gatherings. This was not merely a period of royal misrule. It was a crucial interlude during which the very concept of absolute monarchy was discredited in the eyes of an increasingly enlightened and embittered populace, silently preparing the stage for the dramatic upheaval that would follow just a few short decades later. The king's indulgence had become a cancerous growth, metastasizing throughout the nation, threatening to consume the entire body politic in a conflagration of revolutionary fervor. Then, in a chilling twist of fate, the very natural world seemed to deliver a stark and visceral judgment upon the decadent court. In April of 1774, a virulent smallpox epidemic swept through France, a grim reaper that spared neither peasant nor prince. Louis XV, despite his advanced age and his years of moral transgression, had managed to avoid the dreaded disease for decades, a testament perhaps to his relatively cloistered existence. But his luck, and perhaps his divine protection, finally ran out. While visiting one of his beloved young mistresses, Madame du Barry, at the Trianon, he contracted the dreaded illness. The initial symptoms, a fever and a terrible headache, were dismissed as a common cold, but as the telltale pustules began to erupt on his skin, spreading rapidly and horribly, the gravity of the situation became undeniable. A wave of terrified silence, quickly followed by a flurry of panicked activity, swept through Versailles. The very air seemed to thicken with apprehension as courtiers and physicians, often clad in layers of protective clothing, rushed to his bedside, though many did so with a visible reluctance gripped by the palpable fear of contagion. The court, once a vibrant hub of intrigue and social climbing, transformed overnight into a somber, almost morbid space, where whispers of the king's deteriorating condition replaced the usual gossip and political machinations. His confessor, summoned to administer last rites, famously demanded that the king publicly confess his sins and dismiss Madame du Barry, a demand that, in a testament to the king's defiance even in extremis, was met with resistance until his condition worsened irrevocably. The public, long alienated by his scandals and misgovernance, received news of his illness not with expressions of grief, but with a chilling apathy, or even a grim sense of morbid satisfaction. The once beloved king was now dying, and for many, it felt like a karmic inevitability, a divine retribution for a reign consumed by personal indulgence and neglect. The physical decay of the monarch mirrored the moral decay of his rule, a stark, undeniable visual indictment. The final days of Louis XV were a horrifying spectacle of physical torment and profound isolation, a gruesome, drawn-out demise that seemed almost a fitting, if macabre, retribution for a life of unchecked indulgence and moral dereliction. As the smallpox ravaged his body, the king's once handsome features rapidly deteriorated into an unrecognizable mask of weeping pustules, his skin erupting with grotesque lesions that oozed and festered. The stench of his decaying flesh, a putrid combination of disease and gangrene, became so overpowering that even the most hardened courtiers and physicians found it difficult to remain in his presence. Most fled, terrified of contagion, leaving him attended by a shrinking circle of truly devoted servants and the brave few who were resigned to their duty. The once bustling grand apartments of Versailles, typically teeming with obsequious supplicants and ambitious schemers, became a desolate, almost haunted chamber where the dying monarch lay utterly alone, save for the necessary attendants. The blinds were drawn, the air heavy with dread and the macabre perfume of death. His own family, including his grandson and future Louis XVI, were strictly forbidden from approaching, a poignant symbol of the contagious moral decay he had personified. His final public act of atonement, a confession and receiving of the last rites, seemed less an act of genuine repentance and more a desperate attempt to secure salvation, a last-ditch effort to pacify a church and a populace he had so grievously offended. Yet, even this act could not erase the widespread belief that his end was a just punishment. It was not justice for his victims, for their lives had never truly been their own. But it was a chilling warning to those who would wield power without responsibility, a vivid demonstration of mortality's great equalizer. On May 10, 1774, after days of agonizing suffering, Louis XV finally succumbed to the disease. His death was met with a deafening silence from the populace, a stark contrast to the orchestrated mourning that usually accompanied a royal demise. His body, so disfigured by the disease, was hastily interred in a lead coffin and spirited away under the cover of darkness to the royal basilica of Saint-Denis, bypassing the traditional grand procession, a final ignominious journey for a king whose reign had ultimately devoured itself. The legacy of Louis XV remains an indelible stain upon the tapestry of French history, a somber testament to the perils of unchecked power and the corrosive nature of moral decay within the highest echelons of authority. His reign, spanning nearly 6 decades, was characterized by political stagnation, ruinous wars that bled the national treasury dry, and a profound erosion of public trust in the monarchy, culminating in the king's horrifyingly isolated death from smallpox. We must remember that his personal failings were not isolated incidents. They were inextricably linked to the systematic failures of a royal institution that privileged lineage over competence, divine right over public welfare. The chilling reality of the parc aux cerfs, where childhood innocence was systematically destroyed for the gratification of a single man, stands as a haunting motif of the abuse of power, a stark reminder that the system meant to protect them had become their executioner. The king's detachment, his profound inability to grasp the suffering of his subjects, fostered a pervasive sense of injustice and resentment that permeated every layer of society, quietly fueling the revolutionary fervor that would explode just 15 years after his ignominious death. His was a rule defined by moral inversion, where the anointed representative of God on earth became a symbol of earthly depravity, transforming the very notion of kingship from a sacred trust into a public spectacle of scandal and indifference. The historical zoom-out reveals that Louis XV did not merely govern. He inadvertently laid the psychological and political groundwork for the destruction of the Ancien Regime. His reign was a crucial, albeit tragic, pivot point, demonstrating the ultimate fragility of power when it is divorced from responsibility, empathy, and moral rectitude. The story of Louis XV is a sobering insight, not a narrative closure, but a perpetual warning etched into the annals of time, that the true measure of a ruler is not in their divine right, but in their capacity for humanity, and that the seeds of a nation's destruction can often be found in the darkest, most hidden chambers of its leadership. His end was not merely the end of a king, but a profound ethical reflection on the consequences of a system that allowed profound cruelty to flourish unchecked, hauntingly reminding us of the enduring power of historical memory to provoke uncomfortable yet necessary societal self-examination.